Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. After a Russian military jet crashed near the Ukrainian border, both Ukraine and Russia have been accusing each other, offering conflicting versions of their own. The plane reportedly had Ukrainian war prisoners on board, and with many unanswered questions, Moscow has raised doubts about future prisoner swaps. Meanwhile, though the Kremlin has denied it, Putin reportedly sent signals to the U.S. about ending the Ukrainian war, while the Biden administration is already reportedly recalibrating its strategy and has given up on the idea of Ukraine reclaiming its territory. How are diplomatic dynamics around the Ukrainian war developing? For more on this, we invite Professor Min Jeong-hun from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy into the studio. Welcome to the show, Professor Min.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we also have Professor Matteo Legrenzi from Ca' Foscari University of Venice. Good to see you, Professor Legrenzi.
It is good to be here.
All right, let's first talk about the plane crash that reportedly was carrying Ukrainian prisoners of war. Now, both Ukraine and Russia have been trading accusations. How did you see each side's claims?
Well, as you mentioned, it's not still clear who is responsible for the crash of the plane. And the Russian military transport plane, as you know, carrying the Ukrainian prisoners, crashed near the Ukrainian border. And then the Russian government announced that the plane was carrying 65 Ukrainian prisoners who were being transported for exchange, as well as 9 Russians. And it's not still certain what caused the incident. Although the investigation committee was sent to the scene to find out the cause of the incident. Meanwhile, the media reported that the plane seems to be shot down by anti-craft missiles. And some argue, primarily on the Russian side, that Ukraine shot the plane down to prevent the prisoner exchange and blame Russia. And there has been no official statement from Ukraine, but the media also reported that the Ukraine military shot down a Russian transport plane, which was carrying the missiles, not prisoners. So it seems that Ukraine faces difficult situations in terms of who is responsible for the incident. But anyway, we still need to see what actually happened in the incident. Meanwhile, it seems to be clear that the incident created another hurdle for Russia and Ukraine to communicate, to make a progress towards the finding an exit for the war.
All right, I see. They're, for now, just blaming each other around this incident. Now, Professor Legrenzi, to address this issue, the UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting. And though both sides are calling for an investigation, the UN political chief said the organization is not in a position to verify the circumstances around the crash. Is there no chance at all of an investigation taking place?
Well, you know, it is a truism that the first casualty of war is the truth. And this seems to be the case even this time. I mean, it is very difficult to see the investigation going forward. I mean, this is a war zone. Both sides have been trying to spin the news in a direction that is good for the image and from their point of view. So I think sincerely, it's going to be very difficult to get to the bottom of this. But as my distinguished colleague already said, this creates another difficulty, another hurdle in what is already a very difficult and very sort of bloody conflict. So more bad news from this point of view.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Min, some are worried that even the minimum level of humanitarian cooperation is now going to be suspended. And in fact, Kremlin also raised questions saying that nobody could say how this plane crash would actually affect the prisoner swaps in the future. What's your view on this?
Yes, basically I think that Russia will continue to be aggressive to figure out how the plane crashed and who is responsible for the incident. And considering the 9 Russians lost their lives in the incident, the Russian government needed to let its people know about what actually happened in the incident. In addition, I think the Russian government is taking advantage of the incident to blame Ukraine. It seems that currently Russia is dominating the war after Ukraine's counterattack failed last year. So if Ukraine possibly accepts that he shut down the plane and killed its people by mistake, Russia will blame the Ukraine hard and take advantage of the situation to mobilize public opinion about the war. And there is also a possibility that the incident will make Ukraine harder to ask for the international support for the war. Anyway, it seems to be clear that as the war prolongs, Ukraine is facing tougher situations. So it could be plausible to expect that the war will end in Russia's favor in the future.
I see. Tougher situation for Ukraine. Well, up until now, we have been talking about plane crash, but let's talk about some of the reports that have been released. And for this, Professor Legrenzi, Bloomberg recently reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin reached out to the U.S. about talks to end the war in Ukraine. Now, though the Kremlin denied it, do you see any possibility of this being true? And if so, what could be Russia's intentions behind this?
Well, you know, channels of communication are, of course, always open. And from a Russian point of view, the end of the war that freezes the situation according to the current line of control would be very advantageous. However, I doubt this will happen. I mean, Ukrainian resistance to the idea is still too strong. The current American administration will not force a solution on the Ukrainian side, so on the Ukrainian allies. So things may change if there is a new administration in place after the next presidential elections in November. But for now, of course, contacts sort of like continue. But I think it's difficult to see sort of like the current situation, the current line of control being frozen, which is, of course, what Russia would aspire at this point in the conflict.
All right, I see. Well, we are going to talk about what's going to happen when the new administration actually comes into the White House. But before that, Professor Min, according to the Washington Post, the White House is working on a new strategy regarding this Ukraine war that does not involve reclaiming the occupied territories. What's your takeaway from this report?
Basically, that could be the worst the news for Ukraine. But I think that it reflects the cold fact that Ukraine does not have enough military capabilities of recapturing the occupied territories from Russia. As you know, Ukraine could fight against Russia so far, mainly in terms of the international support, like US and NATO. But as the war prolongs, it is getting harder for those countries to provide the military and finance support for Ukraine. So some people argue that Ukraine's counterattack last year was possibly the last chance that it could recapture the occupied territories. And as you know, unfortunately, the counterattack wasn't successful, and Ukraine has made a little progress since then. Of course, it is likely that the Biden administration continues to send support for Ukraine, at least until this upcoming the November election, although it's not clear whether it could persuade, the Biden administration could persuade the Republican Congress to secure additional funding for Ukraine. Anyway, President Biden doesn't want to see a situation where the Ukraine war could make a negative impact for his re-election bid. So the Biden administration will try to, I think, maintain at least the status quo of the war until this November, while it will also figure out what could be the plausible options to finish the war. Meanwhile, I think that Russia positively recognizes the current situation where it is dominating the war. So it will continue to speak out that it is ready to talk to finish the war and wait until this November election. And if the former President Donald Trump is reelected in this November, it is likely that U.S. will push Ukraine to come to the negotiating table to finish the war. So Russia, I think, has nothing to hurry. So taken together, it's getting worse for Ukraine to continue to fight against Russia. And there is a growing possibility that Ukraine will be forced to accept the situation where it will sign a peace treaty without recapturing occupied territories from Russia.
All right, I see your point. Well, staying on the U.S. politics, Professor Legrenzi, with the U.S. presidential election coming later this year, some point out that Putin would not seriously consider ending the war as Trump could withdraw Washington's support from Ukraine if elected. Now, how would the White House's policy actually change if Trump returns?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I agree with my colleague. This is a crucial question. The U.S. presidential elections will be a turning point in terms of the war in Ukraine, or at least could be a turning point, because at the moment it makes no sense for President Putin not to wait this out and see what happens. Because if President Trump gets elected, the scenario will change drastically. Ukraine will probably be forced to settle for less. President Trump has already made this clear during his electoral campaign, and many Republican leaders in Congress have also agreed with him. So it makes sense for President Putin to wait up until November and hope that President Trump gets elected, because then Ukraine will be most probably forced to settle for less.
All right, so Trump coming back to the resolute desk would be the turning point for the war, and Putin would be highly likely to wait until that happens. All right, Professor Legrenzi.
That is correct, yes.
All right. Well, Professor Min, I'd like to also tap on the Russian-North Korea ties now. A handwritten Korean characters were actually on a ballistic missile Russia fired into Ukraine. Based on this, what can we say about the arms transactions between Russia and North Korea?
Well, personally, I think that North Korea is improving its military capabilities based on its cooperation with Russia nowadays. But traditionally, China was a more important partner for North Korea than Russia for its survival. But nowadays, China does not want to improve its military cooperation with Pyongyang, mainly because of its international standing and its strategic competition with the United States. So North Korea does not like China's reluctant positions nowadays, and instead it is fully taking advantage of its cooperation with Russia. And since the Ukraine war broke out, it has improved its military and economic cooperation with Russia. And it seems that North Korea has provided ammunition to Russia, and in return, it has received economic aid, military weapons, and technological advice from Russia. Specifically, I think that North Korea receives a large amount of money by exporting its ammunition to Russia, and such money has been crucial financial resources for North Korea's economic survival and military improvements. And Russia also provides technological advice like one-point lessons for military spy satellites. And overall, it helps North Korea resolve its technological difficulties to enhance its military capabilities, such as the ballistic missiles and ICBMs. In addition, Russia is one of the permanent U.S. Security Council members, and it helps North Korea continue to make military provocations by standing against the international community's efforts to put additional sanctions against North Korea along with China. Meanwhile, Russia seems to welcome the North Korea's military and diplomatic support for Moscow in the Ukraine war. And with North Korea's ammunition, Russia could make up its ammunition shortage, and it could also show off to the international community that Russia isn't alone in the war. So overall, these situations show that the two countries, North Korea and Russia, are in the win-win situation. And therefore, their military cooperation will be maintained or strengthened for some time.
All right. But Professor, this makes me wonder, I mean, North Korea has been enjoying the strengthened ties with Russia because of Ukraine war, right? If it is highly likely that this war is going to end with a peace treaty signed by both Russia and Ukraine, how would the ties between Russia and North Korea become?
We need to see what kind of the strategic environment will change after the Ukraine war. Basically, North Korea will continue to maintain its military cooperation with Russia, but there is a possibility that Russia will have a little bit different strategic considerations in relations to its relations with North Korea. But basically, Russia need to have more friends and partners in competition with the United States. And Russia will also strengthen its cooperation with China. And China also have the strategic considerations in enhancing each cooperation with its friends and partners like Russia, China, and Pakistan, other Iran. So basically, these countries will maintain their cooperations, but in detail, the situation will possibly change as the strategic environment they face will change. So we will see.
All right, I see. Now, Professor Legrenzi, let's stay on North Korea here. The U.S. deputy spokesperson expressed concerns, saying that North Korea's armed support to Russia would prolong the war in Ukraine. How likely is that?
This is actually true, and it points to a much larger question that Professor Min already correctly addressed. I mean, the strategic environment has changed, and I would go even further. I would say that the whole environment when international relations is conducted has changed, because what has changed is the balance between offense and defense in military conflicts all around the world. It takes $1 million missile to shoot down a $15,000 drone. So this creates a different environment for the conduct of international relations. Something similar has happened before World War I and at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So the only answer to these drones is deterrence, but that is very difficult to establish, not just in Ukraine, but also throughout the Middle East, in the current conflicts that beset the Middle East. So I agree with you, I agree with Professor Min, and I would point to this sort of like a new balance between offense and defense to sort of highlight how these conflicts become much more difficult to manage and to resolve.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Min, I'd like to also tap on how Russia issued a warning against Seoul. Its foreign ministry said that support for Ukraine in a reckless manner would jeopardize the relationship between the two countries. But what does it mean by reckless, and what is Moscow's concerns right now?
Well, as you mentioned, the Russian government issued a strong warning regarding South Korea's position to support Ukraine by saying that the South Korea's support for Ukraine in a reckless manner could lead to the collapse of the relationship with Russia. But it did not specify exactly what the reckless actions were to be. But it also pointed out that South Korean, the defense ministry, talked about the need for direct military support for Ukraine, including lethal weapons. So I think that Russia blames basically the South Korea for putting economic sanctions against Russia, and more importantly, it sends a strong warning to Seoul for the possibility of South Korea's direct military support for Ukraine, like sending the ammunition to Ukraine. But meanwhile, I also think that it is about time for both countries to make more effort to manage their relationships diplomatically. As you know, South Korea-Russia relations or the cooperation has been declined since the Ukraine war broke out. But I think Russia still want to maintain its relationship with South Korea. And considering Russia's traditional influence over the Korean Peninsula and nowadays the improving its military cooperation with Pyongyang and Russia's importance in terms of economic security and the current situation of the Ukraine war, that Russia is dominating the war. So I think South Korea also needed to pragmatically manage its relations with Russia. So I hope that diplomatic communications between the two countries will be more active, silently at least, to manage the relations in the coming months.
All right, so it's about time for South Korea to manage ties with Russia because Russia is strengthening ties with North Korea right now. All right, Professor Legrenzi, I'd like to ask your opinion as well. How should South Korea manage sour ties between Seoul and Moscow?
Well, I agree with Professor Min, and one is always hesitant to sort of give advice about these things. But if we look at the Republic of Korea and the way it has been so good in the past at managing the relations with China, which is the main sponsor of North Korea in the international environment, I think that this challenge of the relations with Moscow can also be managed quite well. I mean, it is not beyond the capabilities of an excellent Korean diplomatic service. It is, of course, true at a larger level that the Republic of Korea is more and more a protagonist on the global stage. And, with power comes responsibility. So this is not going to be an easy challenge, but it is, in fact, the other side of the coin from being so much more of a protagonist on the global stage, really a GPS country.
All right, I see. Well, thank you for your advice, Professor Legrenzi. Now, I'd like to ask many more questions, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Min and Professor Legrenzi, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.